Hi everyone, good evening. Thanks for coming to the UAS Ketchikan Campus Library. I'm very pleased to introduce Gary Freitag, Professor of Oceanography through UAF. Before I start talking about Gary, can you please silence your cell phones if you haven't already? So about Gary, his expertise is in oceanography and salmon fisheries. He has also developed expertise in marine mammal necropsy and disentanglement through working with NOAA's Marine Mammal Stranding Network. In addition, he works with research and outreach efforts in the areas of invasive species and baseline marine monitoring, salmon fishery forecasting and assessment. And please forgive my pauses as these are new glasses. I didn't realize how gnarly these are until I started reading. His education, he has a Bachelor of Science in Chemistry through Philadelphia University, a Master of Science in Oceanography through Old Dominion University, and he has done oceanography graduate work through UAF. Since 1972, he has been involved with ocean research in many disciplines, including marine geology, marine chemistry, marine archaeology, fjord sedimentation dynamics, and seagrass surveys. He has worked in the University of Alaska system for 42 years, which is outstanding. Current projects include mariculture extension, Pacific salmon, he works with the Pacific Salmon Commission, Marine Mammal Stranding Network, Southern Southeast Alaska Response Leader, and he works in invasive species monitoring, tunicates, and European green crab. And anytime I talk to Gary, I learn something new. He's just a phenomenal speaker, so you guys are in for a real treat tonight. Will you please join me in welcoming him?
All right, well, thank you. It's good to be here. Nice crowd, anyway. Tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about seaweed farming. I'm getting a lot of people calling me about wanting to get involved in seaweeds and growing seaweeds, things like that. And it's a little more complicated than planting seeds in the ground, it turns out. And it's been a learning experience for me as well to do this, because I'm not an expert in the biology of seaweeds, but I'm learning some of the issues concerned. So the lights, can you dim those just a little bit? And what I'm going to cover tonight is a little bit of the history of kelps and seaweeds, macroalgae, as a lot of people call them. And that's just large bladed algae, as opposed to microalgae, which are things like the phytoplankton in the ocean and things like that. And then why we're interested in this potential industry in the state of Alaska, as well as a support of something like subsistence, which I want to talk about. What the Alaska potential is for this industry. We can talk a little bit about that. I've got a lot of statistics that I've pulled out of places that might be of interest. Then we're going to talk, I'm going to really go over quickly a little bit of the biology of the brown and red algae, because primarily those are the two types of algae that they're talking about doing most of the mariculture or aquaculture. Mariculture, by the way, is commonly selected for things like shellfish and algae and seaweeds and things like that. Aquaculture includes everything, including fish. So like the Southern Southeast Regional Aquaculture does the salmon aquaculture. That's kind of aquaculture. Mariculture is commonly, in this state at any rate, mariculture is kind of more oriented towards shellfish and seaweeds now. I'm going to talk a little bit about how you culture it, a little bit about the harvesting techniques, what's involved, because everybody wants to get involved in this, but they don't realize how really complex it is. What the commercial farming industry is doing. Mention a little bit about permitting, marketing, because that's also something we've got to talk about. And then currently what's being done. And then I've got a little bit of information that I can share with you on how to get real detail on a lot of these subjects. So Initially, when you look at traditionally, and Priscilla's here, so she knows a lot about traditional usages of the marine algae and kelps and seaweeds. And the bull kelp was utilized very heavily by the Northwest Coast Indians for fishing gear. They used the bull kelp, which is this kelp right here, where you've all seen this laying on the beaches or floating in the water. And the kelp is I'm going to talk a little bit about the biology of it in a minute, but the kelp has, it basically has an air sac at the top here, and these are the fronds, and we'll talk about that, but this sac is filled with, actually it's carbon monoxide, by the way. Most people don't realize that, but it's carbon monoxide, and the reason is because it's less soluble in seawater. Therefore, it doesn't fill up with seawater and remains a gas that keeps it floating. It doesn't hurt it at all. It's still, it's just a gas in there. But anyway, the stipe was used for making ropes, things like that. They used to make fishing lines with it, nets, harpoon lines, and those kinds of things. Plus, of course, most of the seaweeds were also something on the diet as a vegetable plant, basically a plant to support the subsistence harvest. So that happens. So why are we going to do this? Why do we even care about this? Well, one is subsistence use. We want to be able to guarantee a subsistence use. You might ask, well, why is subsistence a problem? I'm going to show you something that I didn't even know when I started researching this about the use of kelp. A lot of it in this road system off of Ketchikan, it's illegal to go out and just take kelp. Even kelp that is broken off the bottom and washed on the beach, you're not permitted to take it. Okay? And I'll explain that. It's kind of an interesting thing, which I had no idea. The other thing is there is also a problem associated with some of the harvest now, some of the species. It's getting harder and harder, even for subsistence use people, to go out and find things like the preferred type seaweed, which I'll talk about. It's getting more difficult, and especially as the communities get older. It's in a very, one of the most important ones is black seaweed, which you've probably all heard of. It's porifera. It's same thing, Nori is really the common name that people like to prefer to use that. And it requires a high energy coast. And a high energy coast is, it's hard to find nowadays, in terms of the ones that were accessible have been picked over pretty heavily. And algae are very vulnerable to being eliminated by subsistence harvest. So we want to look at potentially seaweed to bring that to a stable position where we can supply the subsistence type species to folks. So commercial potential, economic diversification, community resilience, all these things are quite important. One of the things that we need in the Southeast, as you well know, is more jobs, for one thing, and you want to have something that's a good economy driver. Algae, you're going to see, I'm going to show you a little bit about why that's important. Food security, resilience in communities is becoming more of an issue in places. People want to be able to feel like they've got products that they can harvest naturally in the environment. It also is something that is fairly low environmental impact, and in fact may be positive in some cases. If you think of algae, or macroalgae actually, if you think about it, it's a plant. So what does it do? It goes through photosynthesis, which means it takes carbon dioxide and generates oxygen and food sources. Well, what's the problem in the ocean right now? Ocean acidification. I think I gave a presentation a while back that talked about ocean acidification. Well, seaweeds potentially take the carbon dioxide, which creates ocean acidification, out of the seawater. And in fact, pHs in places where it's real dominant culture, actually, in fact, in some of the, especially inside the hatcheries that are they're producing some of this algae, having problems. They have to acidify the water because it goes the other way. It gets too basic. So potentially it has a positive environmental impact. The other thing it does do, even though it isn't good for a food source, is algae have a tendency to collect all the minerals that are in the water, the trace metals and all those kinds of things. So we have to look at that and make sure we're not getting too much of that into the algae that we grow in the water. But it has a tendency in places where they're growing large populations of algae, it's actually improved the water quality in those areas. So wild harvest is becoming more restrictive. So let me show you an example. This is what I was talking about. This is right from the Fish and Game site. If you go to it, it says, in an area closed to taking of kelp and other aquatic plants, a person may not harvest kelp that is alive and growing, no matter if the live kelp or seaweed is attached, free-floating, or washing up on the beach. And that means subsistence areas. And I questioned that just recently at a meeting I was just at, where a young scientist was working on this. And I said, what's the purpose of not letting people take it off the beach? And I said, you know, it doesn't make sense. You know, it's not on the beach anymore. It's not alive. But the interesting thing is, when you look at the life cycle of these things in spawning, they go through a lot of stress. When they break off and they wash them, they dry out on the beach, and then the water comes up. A lot of that is exactly what causes the reproduction of the spores, which makes the next generation. They have to go through a phase in which they're stressed in order to release their spores into the environment. In fact, we're going to talk about the culture. When they gather the tissue with the spores, they take that, they dry it off, they put it in the refrigerator in a dry location for a long time and stress the bejesus out of it, and then it ends up releasing the spores the next time you put it in regular seawater. So you think about it, it's possible, and again, a lot of the biology of this we're not real certain of, but there's a good possibility that role of when storms break off algae and it washes onto the beaches, that might be one of the mechanisms that's evolved over time to actually increase the production of the algae in the marine environment, which is interesting. But somebody has to learn about that. And I looked at this, and this ends up being Ketchikan. The coast area easily accessible to most Alaska populations are designated as non-subsistence areas. These 5 areas are near Anchorage, Valdez, Fairbanks, Juneau, and Ketchikan. If you look at this is all of Cook Inlet is off bounds for going out and collecting algae or kelp. Ketchikan, this is the line, which is non-subsistence area. You'll notice it goes around Metlakatla, and which is why one of the reasons we're going to work there. And but the point being is, these are all essentially, kelp is somewhat protected. Now, I don't know that anybody would bother you. I mean, it's going to depend upon the ADF&G person that's running the office and the state troopers and all that other stuff. But they potentially have the right to stop you from taking it, okay, in our area, which is, I didn't know that. But it is an issue. Yeah, a lot of people collect it for their gardens. And I don't think they're going to stop you. You probably can get permission to take lots of that kind of thing, because it looks like it just sits there and rots. You know, and dries up and rots. Yes?
Well, how do you know if it's alive or dead then?
Well,
if
the blade is soft and pliable, it's probably still alive. Because the thing at the base is not roots. Everybody always thinks it's roots. It's not. That's just a holdfast. That just holds it on rocks or anything. Kelp is totally free floating, so all the nutrition comes through the leaves. None of it comes through that base. You know, when you see that clump that looks like roots at the base, it's not roots. That's just a holdfast. It's just something that's to grab onto something so it can stay in a spot. That's all it is. All the nutrition is still passed through the leaves. So as water's washing up on it, it's probably getting nutrition. It's probably getting what it needs. Yes?
In talking to Scott Walker at Fish and Game, What he has told me is no, we should not be harvesting any kelp along the shores here. They probably, like you said, won't do anything, but they are not happy that UAS, among others, has programs where people tell people to go harvest kelp along the road system.
Well, it's an issue, but that's just what the law is. I don't
Yeah.
think they're going to stop anybody from doing that stuff. I mean, your subsistence people in this community have been
Yeah.
using it for years. They're probably not going to want to deal with that issue. You know, I don't think they would. You know, they've got way more important, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, they just
more
wish
important-
people weren't kind of pushing
Yeah.
subsistence use on the road system, that they were telling them that it's not really acceptable.
Well, there's a lot of places you can go, but like I said, it's they usually look at it from the road system, and that's what Fish and Game says. And
Yeah.
I didn't know that, by the way. I've collected it. Don't let anybody tell them that, but I've collected it myself.
Your citations in the car.
Yeah, my citation's in the car. Okay, so kelp provides habitat. That's one of the reasons why they worry about the kelp beds. It provides a real good nursery area for fish. It provides, as I said, a healthy marine environment. And so I understand why they're trying to be restrictive. And we are seeing a lack of, I mean, I've noticed kelp beds disappearing. And I've had fishermen tell me, where are all the kelp beds we used to have here? And it's not because of a lot of the other reasons why we lost kelp, but it's definitely changing over time. So what's the Alaska potential? Well, I'm not going to go through a tremendous amount, but I want to talk about the Asia Pacific area because that's where the potential markets are. And the potential seaweed market, like global industry with demand share, exceeds 80% in 2015. The growth in that region is driven by growing human consumption and increasing usage in agriculture industry. Indonesia, China, projected to experience vigorous growth, followed by Japan. Europe is anticipated to grow at the second highest rate over the forecast period on account of increased use of seaweeds in the medical and healthcare industry. North America and Europe are also expected to experience high demand for this since the food sector, owing to its high nutritional and proteins. It's extremely healthy for you. And if you look at what's happening, wild harvests along this dark line, the dark bars are wild harvest, and this is the farming as of about 2013 or so, 2014. You can see what that's the farm product right there. So you can see how much, this is in metric tons, production in metric tons. Okay, and you can see what's going on. There's such a demand for this that it's going up dramatically. We don't know how to tap into this yet. We're still looking at it. I have a person on our Sea Grant committee that is same kind of, he's a specialist in marketing and especially in Asia. Quentin Fong, his name is, and he is looking at how do we enter into this market. If we start generating a lot of these seaweeds, what are we going to do with them? Right now, that's a real issue for some of the farmers. So, wild harvest is only about 4%. Now, and again, if you start digging into the statistics, you're going to get numbers that fluctuate quite a bit around each of these. But it's just right, averages right in this range, that much of a difference. This was something I just pulled off today. It's global aquaculture production, and this was on a grant opportunity, believe it or not, where they're trying to get people to apply for grants to produce algae. And they were showing how much the demand is increasing in metric tons. And this is in wet weight, by the way. So you get it in wet weight. So when you sell it, you're selling a lot of water too at the same time, which is kind of interesting. Anyway, it's led by China and Indonesia. And you can see here this dark blue bar here is all China. Right here, that's doing most of the global aquaculture production in metric tons. And then there's a lot of all these other, mostly Asian countries and things. working with this stuff. What kind of algae are they growing? You know, the algae are generally classified by color, even though color has little to do with it, because I've seen lots of what's called a green, what are part of the green algae that are brown, and part of the brown algae that are green. So I mean, the color is really, you have to look at the life cycles in order to really determine whether it's a green algae or a brown algae. But in general, brown algae have a brownish color, and green algae have a greenish color, and red algae have a reddish color, red seaweeds. But anyway, if you look at what's being produced, primarily, it's reds and the browns. A little green, like Ovalactuca, which you've probably seen in the tide pools, the green sea lettuce, a lot of times people call it. It's common all over it's Ovalactuca. It's all over both coasts, well, all the coasts in North America, I'm sure. And that algae is cultured in a few places, but you can see that the amount of culture of that is very, very low in comparison to the brown algae. The red brown algae, the red algae here, those are porifera or Nori, basically, and they're a real thin blade. And what they do is they gather that and they mash it into squares and wrap your sushi in it and those kinds of things. That's what the red algae are. This is also something in metric tons. Well, what can you yield, what you can produce in the various coastlines? So I looked at this, and that grant opportunity said this is where we think you can produce these things. And if you look here, this chart up here of the world is really the red, where red is capable, where you're able to grow reds very efficiently. And in fact, you're talking about in Ketchikan here, it looks like 7 or between 7 and 8, which is medium suitability for growing it, which means that it's capable of, the coastline there is capable of at least about 116 wet metric tons per hectare per year, which is a lot of biomass. This bottom graph here is associated with the brown algae, I think. Yeah, brown is macroalgae suitable map. And you can see that, again, it's in exactly the same kind of category of medium capability. And what's causing this to be high, medium, or low? A lot of it has to do with the nutrient levels, the solar index, the temperature of the water, the salinity. They're very dependent upon all those factors. That drives the success of these algae to grow. And so they're very, it's kind of an interesting aspect. And if you look here, the brown algae are also in the 7 and 8 region, which is anywhere between 135 and 129 wet metric tons per hectare per year, which is quite a bit of biomass that it's capable of in this area. What are they used for? Well, everybody always thinks it's, they're just using for fertilizer or biofuels and stuff like that. And we're gonna talk about the uses here in a moment. So seaweed production right now worldwide is about $10 billion US dollars a year growing. It's actually the biggest aquaculture product overall, shrimp and fish and tilapia and all those things. It's the biggest product that's being grown for using aquaculture in the world. It just isn't in the U.S., okay? It's being done in other places. So 27% is being used for fertilizers, feed, medical, and biotechnology. The rest is food. 83% is food in the world, okay? 80% of that production is being used for human consumption, people eating it and consuming it. So we saw those numbers a while back, and I had a grant, and this grant is still active, and it was called the Alaska Mariculture Diversification, Innovation, and Technology Grant. And we wanted to work with existing farms. The reason we wanted to work with existing farms was a very simple reason. The permitting process is about 18 months to go through the permitting to get a farm straight out for kelp. It's something in that range. I've heard it running a little bit less and a little bit more. But if you've got an oyster farm, it's a permit alteration, which is about a month or two. So, person with an oyster farm can go ahead and just jump right into this, get their permit altered, in addition to it, amend it so that they can produce kelp. And we thought about that, so I got a sea grant, national sea grant, that we were diversifying farms. This is Eric Wyatt's farm, who sells oysters here in town frequently, and Barb Morgan's, if those of you that know Barb Morgan, it's her brother-in-law that has this farm, and he's one of the key people. We grabbed onto him, and he's growing kelp on his farm. And we were able to we were just trying to see if we could get people to diversify their economy. Now, why would an oyster farmer want to do this? There's a couple reasons. One, it's another revenue stream for them. It's also important because when you have oysters, sometimes you have to not harvest your oysters because of things like paralytic shellfish poison, PSP. They have to put them back down, let them depredate the poisons out of it, and then they're fine to sell them later on. But what do they do during those periods when do they have a revenue stream? So diversification is really a good thing in any farm, any capability. It's good to diversify what you're growing. And so we put this grant together. We also did the same thing with Trevor Sandy, his oyster farm by Back Island. This is his farm here, and I went out there and I actually put my camera, which has, it's just one of those little cameras that was waterproof, and I put it underwater and took a picture of his kelp growing on these lines next to his oyster pens. And this is some of the kelp he's growing. He's growing bull kelp, Neurocystis. And there's a reason why he's growing Neurocystis, and that is because of the market. There is a market for it. And the person that he's marketing a lot of it to is Barnacle Products in Juneau, which develop salsas and things like that associated with the bull kelp. They would love to expand their operations, and they couldn't do it because Fish and Game won't let them go out and commercially. It's really forbidden to go out and get it and sell the algae. That's really a big negative. They will come after you for that one. And so he's having trouble getting enough kelp to expand his business, and they're doing well with their business. So Trevor is growing bull kelp for him and sending it up, and they're using it in their process. Okay, so we actually do have a niche market, and that's what we're going to see. Is the only thing really available right now are niche markets for us right now. It doesn't mean we can't expand into the Asian market and all those other places. We're trying to work on that. So the biology, you've all seen the whole plant is really the thallus. This is called the blade. Sometimes there's a mid-rib. Not all of them have it. We're going to find that they don't all have it. The little thing like that was making the rope in the bull kelp is called a stipe. And then there's the holdfast. Again, this holdfast does nothing but hold on to stuff. Doesn't provide nutrients to the plant. You know, like you always think that that's roots and providing all the nutrition up there, but it isn't. Okay, all the nutrition is going straight through the blades. The cells on the blades are just simply taking the nutrition out of the ocean. So this is Mike Steckel's work. This is from a presentation he made that I was part of, and I think we gave it in Juneau a while back. And Mike works for the University of Alaska Southeast, and he is the expert, to be honest with you, in seaweed culture. He's done it for years and years. He's got, 20 or 30 years worth of experience working with kelps and algae and how to grow them. He knows the life cycles. He knows how to make this all happen. And we're working with him to see if we can learn from him at how to do this properly, because most of us don't know what we're doing. And we got to learn how to do it right, because it is not simple. It takes a lot of work. But this shows the life cycle. So if you look at you think of if you think of a land plant, where you have a flower, bugs come and pollinate it, and it grows, it's the seeds come out and they grow. Well, these don't grow seeds. These are spore related. But they have a real complicated life cycle. If you look at this, there's a thing called the sorus tissue. Sorus tissue is where all the spores are located on the blades. And this is called a sporophyte when it's a large blade. They call it a sporophyte. And initially it starts out small and it's called a sporophyll. In fact, when it becomes, this is the what we call the large blade part of the plant where you can see it. There's another phase in algae called the microscope phase, basically, microscopic phase. That's the planktonic stages and where all the spores are related and things like that. By the way, a single plant can have billions of spores, okay? A lot of spores. So they can produce a lot. So this is showing you what happens. The spores are released. They're released after stress. Whether it be bad weather, whether it be cold weather, the spores are released. They settle somewhere, and they germinate. Okay? After they germinate, they release these gametophytes, which there's both female and male gametophytes that swim around, okay, and get transported around. Eventually they mature and they meet up, of course, and bond with each other and get their genes all together, and eventually they produce a mature little recruit that goes out, and that becomes a juvenile, and then eventually it becomes a large blade again. That's a simple brown algae. This is a diagram of a brown algae. Not quite so simple in the red algae, which I'll show you a little bit later here. So this is settling. It's really the two different segments of what's going on. So the kelp life cycle, this is just another one. I'm not going to go through the details of this, but this is still the same kind of a thing, which is showing you what happens in a kelp life cycle, where you're getting a bunch of different stages, and a lot of these stages are microscopic, and then other stages are simply when they're growing. The life history of Nori, which is a red algae, is a little more complicated. It has phases in which some of it's vegetative, which means it doesn't even get fertilized. It starts breaking off and growing new plants from it, which is vegetative growth. And it doesn't have both a male and a female gene at times. But it also has that as well. So there's all kinds of phases in here. The interesting thing to get from this, and you don't need to worry about all this complicated stuff, what you need to think about is there are places where you don't have to exactly fertilize. You can intercept these in different places, and it requires totally different culture techniques in order to grow the plants by selecting this phase versus this phase or this phase. You can grow it in different ways. And in fact, in history, that's exactly what they've been doing. So culture, what are the steps? If you're going to culture these in a hatchery, for example, and get it going, what are the steps? Well, you collect it here, collect the kelp. This is the sorus tissue in the middle here. That's not a midrib. That's the sorus tissue where all the spores are. You identify and isolate that sorus tissue, because that's where all the spores are, the billions of spores. You remove excess biofouling. What do I mean by biofouling? Diatoms, protozoa, bryozoans, all those things will have a tendency to collect on the leaves, okay, of these when they're growing in the seawater, and they interfere with your culture. You clean, get rid of some of the mucilage, and you wipe all that clean, you dry it, you rinse it real well with filtered, chilled water, and put a little iodine on it to kill off some of the protozoa and diatoms. Disinfect the tissue, which means you dip the source tissue in 3% iodine solution for 30 seconds. You prepare overnight storage, place pieces on dry paper towel and cover with additional sheets of paper, and then you refrigerate it. That's stressing this. Then all of a sudden, they want to release. Then all of a sudden, you prepare the settling tubes. You chill 2,300 milliliters of chilled water, seawater, for each settling tube. Place the tank lid on the top and set the tubes in to prevent contamination. What do I mean by settling tubes? Well, I'll show you that in just a second. Here's a picture of some source tissue right here on the blade. You've probably all seen this if you've collected the large blades of bull kelp. You can see this very clearly on there. And this is out at Oceans, Alaska. And this is them collecting some of the source tissue and out there. And this is just part of the process at Oceans, Alaska. This is collection. You can see the source tissue. And sometimes you'll see blades with a big hole like this. What that is that plant has released its source tissue. And it's released its spore into the marine environment before you pick that up. That's what it is. And you can see that in these pictures here. Like here's a spot where the source tissue, all the spores came out. That's you know it's ripe. When you start seeing that happening, you know that the spores are ready to be released. And that's important if you're going to culture this stuff. You got to go through the water. You got initial filtration. You transport it. You store it. You fine filter it and sterilize it and culture it. Now, what do I mean by sterilizing issues? Well, cultures to grow seaweed, the microscopic and juvenile phases are sensitive to contamination. There's a host of microorganisms that can feed or compete with or overgrow the macroalgae cultures, including other algae, so other species can get on there that are undesirable, fungi, bacteria, cyanobacteria, microzooplankton, like protozoa, which is what you see in the background here that I pulled a picture of. And grazers but protozoa are the big deal. Grazers will especially be a problem for microscopic stages of kelp or the seaweed. So you got to get rid of all that stuff. So you got to sterilize it. Here's diatoms. This is a diatom here driving into one of the seaweed culture, a picture of it. And these are a problem. They get on the blades and can cause lots of problems with your culture. In fact, they may collapse your culture. So it's important to sterilize the stuff, and you can sterilize in a lot of ways. You can autoclave it. You can use chlorine. There's a chlorine type treatment. There's heat type treatment. There's a bunch of different ways of doing it. And I'm not going to go through all that stuff because I'm going to give you some resources. If you get interested in the details, you can go get these manuals for free, and they show all the ways you can tell you how to make the sterilizing compounds and everything else. So it's pretty good. The species selection we're messing around with here now are these: Alaria, Narcissus, which is the bull kelp, and this is sugar laminaria right here. It's a kelp, and it doesn't have a midrib. But this is one of the preferred species that they're doing all over the East Coast and West Coast. Is this particular one here? Alaria is more common. You can get this very easily. Alaria, by the way, one of the species of Alaria is the same thing when you go to a sushi restaurant and you get that little green seaweed that you buy a salad. That's an Alaria species. And believe it or not, this brown seaweed, if you treat it with heat or even treat it a little bit, it turns bright green. Okay? So the sugar laminaria is the one we really are looking at, and that lends itself to what we call seed string culture. And I'm going to show you what that is. What you do is you stress that blade. You take after you've stressed it, sterilized the water, you put it in the sterilized water, and you put it in aquarium, and the tubes, the strings, like these tubes right here, are covered with a special string. It's wrapped around there, and I'll show you why they do that in a moment. But they put it on there, and they put them in the seawater, and they have light banks. And the lights allow those spores will hang on to those strings and then start growing on those strings, okay? And this is what it looks like. This is week 4, for example. This is a close-up from a manual that I could give you I can show you a copy of it, of this handbook. This is incredible. It's about that thick and it's free. And a close-up of the string. This is string. It's only about maybe a 1/16 of an inch in diameter string. And these are little plants growing on it. These are where the spores have set and are developing. And Mike put this together. This is what it looks, the string looks like after a little bit longer period. All the little blades are growing on there. So now you got this pipe that's about this long and about that big around with the string all wrapped around it. What good does that do? How are you going to grow stuff in that? Well, it turns out, here's Oceans, Alaska. In fact, I got this today from Connor, who's working down there. And he's, that's bull kelp, by the way, starting to grow on there. These are, what you see on them is just a brown fuzz on there. And that, if you looked at it with a microscope, you'd see all those little blades of algae growing on it. The idea of this tube is kind of interesting. What you do, you want to put this thing in the marine environment so it can grow, okay? So how do you get that little string wrapped around a rope? Well, very easily. What you do is you take a rope, like a 1/2-inch line, you put it through that tube, and you tie strap it to one end of that string, and then you start walking it away. And as it unravels, it wraps right around the rope, and you can go hundreds of feet, and you have all those little plants strung out now, hundreds of feet long. And that's how the culture is done. And you can see it right here. See how there's the line coming along as they motor away from the main line that they're attaching it to, and it's anchored in the water. Okay? And it's usually submerged about 5 feet below the surface, by the way. So it's pretty inventive, and then it just starts growing off of that. So what's the maintenance on that? You've got to be able to go out, you've got to keep an eye on temperature, salinity, turbidity, nitrogen levels. Nitrogen levels have a lot to do with whether this stuff survives. And sometimes you've got to control flotation, because some of these algae, not like bull kelp, but some of the others like laminaria, don't float. They go to the bottom. So when you get these big plants there, they're going to get heavy. You get metric tons on these lines that's going to sink the line. So you got to put floats on the line, along the line. That's what you saw in Trevor's photograph there. All those floats were there to hold that line up, because what happens? You want those plants to be at the surface. That's where the sunlight is. And they're plants. And you go out and you maintain it. You go check for biofouling on the plants. Sometimes you get stuff like, you've probably seen this on it. That's bryozoan that's growing on there. And it doesn't hurt the plant, but it does hurt the quality of the food source. So you're going to be doing that if you're going to harvest this stuff. In fact, you harvest it, you put it in the water in the fall, in September, October, and you harvest it probably in March. It'll grow big enough by March to harvest all winter long. You wouldn't think that it would grow very well in the winter, but it does. It grows underwater quite well. And the reason you do that is because you want to avoid keeping it in the water before this stuff starts and degrades the food quality of the algae. Okay? And you've all seen bull kelp and Nerecistus. This is what you end up pulling up. This is some laminaria up. I think this is a Kodiak group that was doing it, that we're working with in Kodiak, one of those same diversification projects. And you can see what happens when they harvest in other parts of the world. I was going to show just a couple quick pictures of what they do in places like China. This is China, a farm. Go back to that. You can see they're growing laminaria large. Some of their blades are real big. Depends on temperature. Temperature has a lot to do with it. Salinity has a lot to do with it. But you can see the size of their farms. If you looked at that graph and saw how much culture, look at this. Look at the size of that farm. We wouldn't want to be doing anything like that. That would be a problem. But the habitat under that is a pretty good source for growing fish too. I'm sure there's a lot of juvenile fish that are rearing in those areas because it provides habitat. That's why they're so important. Argentina and Patagonia, they do beach collection. A lot of this is wild harvest. They do a lot of those things in places, and a lot of this is in Baja California doing some of the red algae that they're harvesting there. And so what about the red algae? Let's talk a moment about those. The porifera, Pyropia, they keep changing the name. In fact, you can't tell the different species by looking at it. The only way to deal with it is genetically. If you really want to know what species they are, you have to be able to do genetic profiles on them. So most people now just call these red algae Nori, a general term. 4 major steps for cultivation of the black seaweed that we are really interested in. Culture of what's called the Conchicellus phase, which is a strange, it's really a strange phase of that life cycle, which I'll show you in a second. Seeding of the nets with spores from that phase after inducing the release. Inducing the release, how do you do it? Like I say, they probably putting it in a refrigerator and drying it and causing it a lot of distress, and all of a sudden it wants to let all its spores out or something like that. Nursery rearing of nets, setting with small bladelets, and then harvesting of the blades. Interestingly enough, in a lot of places like Asia, they grow them in oyster shells. They actually, it turns out that the spore, that phase, the Conchicellus culture, the spores float to the surface. They stay right at the surface. They're positively buoyant. And in order to do that, they dip the oysters up and down in there, and they actually bore into the shell material. So it's a complicated life cycle. And they also can also do it on nets. A lot of places use netting. They just lay nets on the surface of the water, and when the spore gets in contact with the net, they attach to it. Okay, and that's some of the technique. They also have used this in Korea, which is interesting. They actually put netting on the outside of big wheels, and since the spores are at the surface, when they get the cultures in here at the surface, they just simply keep rolling this around, and the spores attach to the netting that's on the surface of that. It seems strange to me. I mean, it looks like a lot of work to. It seems like you just, but I guess you can do a large volume by doing it this way. This is some netting of the red algae, porphyra nori, and you can see the magnitude of what this industry, and that's why I was telling you that the culture is really huge in other countries. It's just not huge in the U.S. We always think of seaweed as it's a weed. Why would you worry about it? But the reality is, it's really a major aquaculture product, the biggest. Few species in Alaska. These are the black seaweeds that we prefer. 2 species here of black seaweed. They're both porifera species. And what if the plants are not fertile? There's ways. Sea Grant was determining, and I think this is one of Mike Steckel's projects where he's looking at what do you do if you're not getting the spores ready at the right time. You can actually determine. They're working on determining when natural plants are fertile, which it turns out is different in every location, which is interesting. Which means you've got to learn how to do it here versus other places. The gametophytes and sporophytes. Gametophytes are the microscopic phase. Sporophytes are the whole big plant. And can they be cold banked? In other words, can you take them, put them in cold weather, and keep them dormant so you can hold it until you're ready to put them into the ocean? Temperature, light, salinity, nutrients, all can control that. Can we seed strings with cloned gametophytes for large-scale cultivation, which means you're not really spawning them or causing reproduction normal. You can actually clone these by just taking blades of some of the red algae and grinding them up, and then each one of those little blades will then grow a new plant. And if that happens, they're all the same, they're from the same plant, so they're exactly the same DNA. So that's a clone. So you can do that stuff. They're actually messing with that stuff right now in other countries. Determine optimal conditions for growth in the lab. You can also grow these things in tanks with lighting, proper lighting and cooling and aeration. You got to be able to put a lot of aeration. So what about the markets? Here's those products that I was telling you about that Trevor's selling to these folks. These are salsa that's being grown, being marketed out of Juneau. They're a Juneau company and doing a great job at creating some nice products from it. They're using this as the product. That's what they're making that salsa out of, which is a picture I took underwater diving a while back. Black nori seaweed. You've seen this in Costco and places like that. And in Billy's store, he's got nori in places in there. I'm sure you buy it quite a bit, different places. Nori is important. There's ocean approved. There's a company in the East Coast that's producing noodles from it. They're doing all kinds of products from energy bars and kelp granules that you sprinkle on your rice and things like that. Marine hydrocolloids, alginate, carrying all these agar, all those things are used in toothpaste, ice cream, all kinds of things. You can't imagine how much of this stuff is used in all kinds of products. They're actually making paper from seaweed fiber in some places. Definitely soil type things for gardening, fertilizers, medical. There's a whole lot of medical applications that are being used now and with algae. And then you can talk about biofuels and biotechnology. I don't know that that's as profitable as the food segment of what you can do with this stuff, but they do two things with it. You can use either microalgae, in which you can make biodiesels, and then macroalgae, you really, in order to make anything useful from the big kelp plants, they have to produce things like methane from the decomposition of the large blades. Ethanol and butanol by fractionation of fermented sugars, you can make that. Potential for fuel, feed co-products, especially aquaculture feeds, is being explored real heavily right now. This is just, again, biofuels, showing just what they look like, and this is all being harvested for fuels. What about the things that impeding us right now? I'm calling these bottlenecks for the industry facing Alaska. We still have to learn the seaweed culture technique that works here. We're doing pretty good. Mike Steckel is the key to this, I think. Genetics. What do I mean by genetics? Fish and Game has got a regulation. If you want to start a farm in the marine environment here, you cannot go get algae for anywhere more than 50 kilometers away from its original. In other words, it has to come within a circle of 50 kilometers, which puts a real problem. If you've got a hatchery, in Ketchikan, there's only 2 hatcheries that are actually messing with anything with this, and that's Oceans, Alaska, here in town, and there's one in Seward called a Lutek hatchery. They're the only 2 that are capable of doing this stuff. That means a farmer can't just buy a tube of spore-laden string and put it on his farm, which is really what has to happen, because most farmers are not going to want to put the infrastructure in to go ahead and develop that microscope phase where everything's real small and you've got to be sterile and you've got to count cells, you've got to do all kinds of. They're not going to do that. You want to be able to just give them the string and say, here, just put a line out, and pull the line on it, and put the anchors down and farm. You can't do that unless that farmer out in Nocatee, or wherever he happens to be, goes out and finds the algae that he wants to grow there, ships it into Oceans, Alaska. He can't do that. That's the only thing he can do. He can ship it to more than the 100 miles, let them grow it in a sterilized environment, and then ship it back to him. And there's a lot of cost to that, and there's a lot of problems with that. Because getting the algae in good shape, that distance, it degrades extremely fast. And it's hard to do. That's a bottleneck. We've got to get over that. We can do it, but we've got to get over it. And that's what I mean by that. I'm going to show you a shot of why the genetics is important. The farm site, that's a lot of permitting, and that's a bottleneck. It's taking way too long. It shouldn't take 18 months to get a new permit. And that they're working on that. I know Department of Fish and Game is working on that. Water quality sampling, you have to be able to do water quality sampling continuously. You got to make sure there's not contaminants in the water, because they will suck up the contaminants if it's there. Algae do that. They're good at that. The market, that's another spot we need a lot of work with. Transportation is an issue in the state of Alaska. These other places are right next to where they're going to process it. We've got to move stuff 60 miles, 50 miles all the time from our remote farms. How do you do that? We're working on that, and I'll show you how we're doing that. Marketing, I've got a friend, as I said, Quentin Fong, that's working on the market end of this in Asia, as well as the niche markets in the U.S. for this. There is a market for this stuff. There's no question. And then the processing. How do you stabilize the algae? When you collect a metric ton of it, and it's all those big blades of algae, how do you stabilize it and keep it good enough, keep the quality there? It's not easy to do. We need to figure out, do you dry it? Do you freeze it? What do you do? And all those are techniques that they're looking into, and we're working on that as well using the Kodiak lab. And I'll show you what we're doing. Here's that 5 kilometer. If you looked at the Oceans, Alaska facility right now in Saxman, this is the area that you'd have to, the only area that you could actually put a farm in if you gathered kelp for a site right there. You could only do that. You couldn't gather it from anywhere out here. That's because of that 50-kilometer rule. Now, Fish and Game, I've had a lot of discussions with the geneticists on this, and I think that's going to be relaxed, because there's no other place in the world that even comes close to trying to do that. They're just being conservative. They're trying to do the right thing and be conservative and not mess up the gene pool. They don't want the culture of our algae to be selected. You know, you're putting a whole lot more spores in an area if they happen to spawn and put them in that area. Will they spawn and contaminate the genetic diversity of the natural population? You need to be careful of that. I understand why they want to do that. The problem is probably the algae are pretty genetically diverse already all over, so it doesn't make any difference. Whether you collected it there, it's going to still spread the spores, whether it was wild or whether you collected the source tissue and put it in your hatchery. It's probably going to spread them anyway. And the currents will definitely drive it way more than 50 kilometers, because they stay viable for long periods of time. The currents transport stuff hundreds of miles. So we think the genetic makeup is pretty similar all around. It's not like isolated pockets of some genetically unique plants that are adapted to that area, because the currents are moving this stuff all over. So we think that will be relaxed, but they want to know, and they're being conservative. That's just time. They did the same thing on the salmon industry for years, and they finally figured out that that was not an issue, because they're really a real genetic mix all over the place of the same original brood stocks. What about transportation? You've got cold storages here. They're not doing anything most of the winter. Their tenders are sitting at the docks because their salmon aren't here. Why not, since you harvest algae in March or April, why not send a tender out, go to all the farms, collect them in their circulating seawater tanks, and bring it back to a processing plant, utilize the processing plant, get the plants working in the summer, or the winter rather, and do that. The plants are actually very interested in this. So we're working to see if we can make that connection where you're utilizing some of the infrastructure we have in these communities to process something like this that can be very beneficial to them as well as to the farmer, and not have to have this tremendous problem of how do you move 6 metric tons of laminaria from Nocatee into somewhere where you're going to have to process it somehow or dry it. Products, stabilizing. We're looking at using the facility at Kodiak, which is the Kodiak Seafood and Marine Science Center, which is part of the University of Alaska Fairbanks. That's where Quentin is. He's housed in one of these rooms right up here. I can't remember which one it is, but he's in there. And they're going to looking at things like stabilization, energy needs, desirable products, nutritional value, and food safety. So the last thing I wanted to talk about is I've got a grant that I just received, and we're going to be putting, these are 4 objectives of the grant that I just received. It's a SK grant. It's to train interested high school and community members in both Metlakatla and Ketchikan to understand the biology, culture techniques, process and marketing of algae, utilizing pilot-sized farms for each community. That's 3 lines, 3 of those long lines. And to support seaweed aquaculture development by demonstrating the viability and developing a trained workforce to support the industry, to incorporate a program utilizing the resources of Metlakatla High School, Ketchikan High School, University of Alaska, Sea Grant, Metlakatla Indian Community, Ketchikan Indian Community, Ketchikan High School, School District, and the Oceans Alaska Nursery Facility. And then the 4th objective was to develop techniques to address biological bottlenecks to the industry utilizing seaweed species and desirable to the communities involved, develop techniques for processing production for the pilot scale. The idea of this thing is primarily subsistence. The product we get out of this, we're probably going to give directly to the subsistence users. Primarily, the native community will benefit from this, from that standpoint. We're going to give all the equipment, like over in Metlakatla, to them that we buy with this grant so that they can start processing and doing this and maybe developing the red seaweed that they want so desirable to have and they're having trouble getting. We're going to try to make it happen with their people, training them how to do it. And then if they want to start the business, sell it, do whatever they want to do with it, that's the community's decision of what they want to do. So that's what we're trying to do with this grant. And the 4 sites that we've chosen in the grant, now this could change a little bit, but we've got the K2 site is the Ketchikan Saxman site, which is where the Oceans Alaska facility is. Also the one out of George Inlet, that site. There'll be 3 strings of algae there, 3 strings of algae there. The Net Island Bay, where the ferry terminal is another one of the Metlakatla spots. And then Tamgus Bay over here, which is exposed to the outside coast, and it's a high energy coast, and that's where the red algae will do the best. In fact, if you look here, I put high energy, Tamgus Bay. They'll be trying all 3 species there. Porifera is on there. Net Bay, they'll do the lower energy because it's a more calm area, and that's where they'll do the alaria, and which is ribbon kelp, by the way, and saccharina is the sugar kelp. And then over here in Georgia Inlet, we'll probably do just the alaria and sugar laminaria because we don't have a high energy. Although there's some indication now that we might be able to do some porifera here too. It may do just fine. We just need to work on that. And the resources for information I'm going to show you comes mostly from computers. There's a couple books that Sea Grant has. And one is Dolly Garza, who for years did a lot of work here in town as a Sea Grant agent, the same position I'm in. And she worked heavily on seaweeds and put this book out on how you can eat them. And Field Guide to Alaska Seaweeds is a diagram book for that. And I'm going to give you a paper, or at least I'm going to show you where you can get this stuff. This is an incredible manual that you can get a hold of for free, and I'll show you where that's at. It's a lot of the photographs I have in here are from that manual. These are the sources here. Okay, so if you take a picture of that, that's fine. And this is Seaweed Farming in Alaska, which is a seagram that I put out recently. Is just a real generalized idea of this stuff, and I've got some copies of it that we could hand out if you want. I don't have enough for everybody here, but if you've got a computer, you'll be able to get a hold of all this stuff. Because I'm going to give out some things. So, questions?
Go back.
No, you want to go back? I'll leave that on so you can write stuff. But any questions? Yes.
Yeah, if you got to do all this sterilization and stuff, how do these things even propagate in the wild?
Well, in the marine environment, probably only a little bit of the spores make it. Where if you're doing a culture method, you want all the spores to make it, so you get, or a lot of the spores to make it, so you get a lot more plants. And plus, it's more dilute when you're doing it in a confined area, like an aquarium. If you get high concentrations of all those things, it has a tendency. It's just like in a hatchery for fish. You know, they can get a disease and it just spreads through everything. The same thing will happen in an aquarium for culture. So the answer to that is a whole lot of that does happen to the wild ones. That's why we don't have just wall-to-wall kelp everywhere, which we would most likely. You know, a lot of the plants don't make it because they're getting diatoms or feeding on protozoa or feeding on a lot of those stages. I mean, they've evolved to eat those things, and that's the reason there's a lot of that going on. So the answer is it is happening. The protozoa are contaminating the wild ones all the time. It's just that there's enough, when you release billions of spores, there's going to be a few of those make it into a blade and grow. And that's what happens. Any other questions? Yes.
The one seaweed I don't see mentioned is what I commonly call popweed. Is that?
That's fucus.
Is that,
yes.
Okay, was that mentioned in there?
It's in there. It's a brown seaweed. It's of course intertidal. Fucus is primarily intertidal. There's some subtidal too, but there are people that are utilizing it. Yes, they are, and we do use it in the U.S. and I'm sure the native community is used. Is Priscilla still here? Okay, she would know because she's done a lot of work with subsistence foods in this community. But I think fucus is utilized by the, yeah. And it's no reason, it's not, most algae are okay to eat. There's not very many of them that are actually poisonous.
When you have a herring roe on kelp, what?
Yes, and that's macrocystis, which is a different kind of kelp. It's a brown kelp with a lot of little leaves and little air sacs on each blade that comes
Where are
off.
fishermen getting those?
That's one of the reasons why mariculture got started around here, is because they were trying to develop Fish and Game was getting restrictive of the collecting. That's the reason they started doing hemlock branches and things like that. They were using herring growing on hemlock branches and things like that off of the trees, because they couldn't get enough macrocystis. Macrocystis is a little bit higher energy. It's not very common in places where it's calm, and even though that's the preferred algae for setting the herring eggs on it. But they're talking about you could actually farm macrocystis just as easy. That's a brown. It's a fairly simple one to farm. And you could grow that and then sell it to the fishermen so that they could do the herring roe. I mean, you could do that. I mean, that's another niche market, one of the type of niche markets you'd want to explore down the road.
If you can make beautiful blades of kelp, they'd all buy it.
Oh, you could do it easily.
Yeah, so they don't have to sort through it.
Yeah, you could do it. It wouldn't be hard. You can actually genetically select for it, and it's not going to spread the bad genetics around. Genetically select the better blades and keep those alive and sell those. Yeah.
So one of your statistics there was a per ton per hectare
Yeah, metric tons per hectare.
on a wet, I mean, just for the curiosity of it, at a wholesale level, the farmer's gonna take 125 tons of wet and sell it to EC Phillips down here, and they're gonna sell it for 10 cents a pound?
No, no, it's more than that. It goes for it's been selling very high, believe it or not. But after they process it, it's not going to weigh that much. The farmer's going to sell it for some lower number, obviously. But once it's processed, stabilized, which means you probably take some of the water out of it, dry it a little bit, those kinds of things, or you freeze it and make blocks out of it, or whatever the processing technique is, it's probably going to change the value of it dramatically. Like I say, it's a $10 billion industry worldwide, and a lot of those currencies in that 10 billion, that's a U.S. dollar estimate of what its value is. So it's pretty valuable stuff if you can market it. We don't have the capability of marketing it in Alaska right now. Yes.
So you were talking about those little 3-string farms to start. How much would that be worth out of curiosity? You know, $10 billion
dollars?
industry, but how big a farm do you have to make a living?
We're not planning on getting any money.
No, I understand that, but I'm just trying to get a feeling like how big of a farm does someone have to actually make it worthwhile?
It depends if it's strictly a kelp farm or whether it's diversifying an oyster farm. I mean, there's all kinds of, there's a whole bunch going into that. We don't know the answer to the question, is the truth.
So how much is it per metric ton? How much do you suppose, assuming you could get a good market, how
I've
much
heard
is it?
figures that were pretty high, like 60 cents a pound, stuff like that. I mean, I've heard those kind of things. I said, that can't be right, because you're paying for an awful lot of water if you're paying 60 cents a pound. But I don't know what the numbers are. It varies dramatically. The market's probably very volatile. So I don't know the answer to that. But I think that from an economic standpoint, it has the potential to be a very, very large driving force in communities if we can get the industry going. I just don't know. I think it's going to take 10 years, to be honest with you, because there's a lot to do. Those bottlenecks are really significant bottlenecks right now to making this go full blast.
What are the big bottlenecks?
The biggest bottlenecks, I think, is the processing. We need to figure out how to do economical processing, because you don't want to be running big heaters and things like that. The other one is transportation, is a real big one here. We think we might be able to deal with that if the plants here are willing to commit their tenders that they have on contracts with to working with that. It's possible that piece can be accomplished.
Or would we ship out of?
Well, they would be shipped in containers, the same as
Like Craig, Catch a Can we're talking about?
the farms that I've got that I'm working with right now, like you got Trevor's farm, and he's just doing small amounts for the kelp thing. But if you've got Knockety, if several of those farmers are doing this, if they had a tender go over there, they could grab it and bring it into whatever plant is willing to work with it, whether it's Trident or Phillips or one of those. I know that a lot of these plants are showing interest in doing it. There's no question they're interested. They see the market potential.
You've done a nice job on this. Thank you.
But all I'm saying is I think that it's possible that it could potentially happen. It's not there yet. It is definitely not there yet. And we're also a little concerned about trace metals and things like that we've got to look at in the plant itself.
Which trace metals?
Well, I'm talking about things like
Mercury or what?
not mercury, it's cadmium, things like that are available in a lot of these. It's present in seawater anyway, but we've got to be careful of that, and we're going to explore those things. It's not like it's anything different. There's no initial source of it, but I think knowing the marine chemistry of the area, it's going to be important to understand. Some spots might be different sets of minerals than other places, because it's not a big homogeneous soup out there in the marine environment. And we may end up having, some of these places may not be that as conducive to having a real good high quality product or not. So we need to look at those things. Those are bottlenecks that we need to understand.
Well, that actually was one of my questions, as far as the mineralization and runoff, like from our mining industry here too, and affecting these farms.
It's potentially, everything has potential because these things will take those minerals up.
Yeah,
In fact, remember when Fukushima happened?
yeah,
They were looking at seaweeds as the one place that they could identify potentially if there was any kind of radiation moving over to this coast. They never found it, mind you.
right.
But they know that algae pick it up really quickly. That's because you got to remember that blade, the whole blade is sucking in water and nutrients and concentrating minerals. So they will do that. So one of the reasons it's so nice in Alaska is we got a relatively good environment here with
So
very
hot.
little pollution
Yeah.
at this point.
Yeah.
So that means our product might be a very high quality marketable product.
Right. So
So
how,
you got to think about it.
so if we have tidal, right, and we have quite a bit of shoreline, how do you go about getting a permit, or can you just run some lines out there and so?
No, you have to get
Army Corps of Engineers?
it's all that stuff. That's why it's 16, 18 months or something
Okay.
like that.
So do we ask Connor how to do that, or?
Actually, I think you want to go to Fish and Game.
Okay,
They have a spot. I have something, I don't know whether this will work now. I might have to do it from the computer real quick. And that's, if you look here, go to this site right here.
okay,
And if you click on that, you're gonna see it comes up with this is a document that I put together, and it's you can get it for free. It doesn't cost anything, and you can download it. It's free, and I'll give you. I have a sheet here, and I can pass them out. But those that are interested might pick them up. I think I made 15 copies or something. So, but this is a product that we put together for describing a lot of what I've talked about here, not quite as much detail, but it's a pretty simple, like 5 or 6 page document. There's also the Mariculture. If you go to the Sea Grant site, you can go to Mariculture and you can get all these documents. And this is a fantastic manual here on kelp farming. This one here is, there's a webinar that I put together very similar to what we just went through. There's all kinds of documents for culturing and stuff like that. You can just go down, these are all basically free. You can get most of this stuff for free. And that's just at the Sea Grant site. So go to the University of Alaska, Fairbanks, and go to Aquaculture. Sea Grant, just Alaska Sea Grant. If you Google it, you'll get it. And then, and a lot of this is mariculture as well. The other thing I've got, let's see here.
And it's Scott Walker at Fish and Game, right? Locally?
No, I would go to Cynthia Pringham
Oh,
in Juneau is who I would go to. If you look, there's also a YouTube thing that goes through this manual that is just fantastic. It's got 5 segments. If you click on that, shows all the farming techniques, how you sterilize the water, do all that stuff. If you look here, here's all the, on this side, you can see it's got seaweed culture in New England. New England, by the way, in the East Coast is doing a lot of work with seaweeds. Seaweed culture, seaweed, there's Gracilaria, kelp. Here's the porifera here, how to do it. And they're very detailed manuals and they're quite good. I have copies of some of this stuff here that I'll show you. And you can look it up. But I've got a resource sheet that shows you all this stuff here, if you're interested. Here's the 2 books that I showed, Dolly's book and then the seaweed book. This is a manual that's got this one you have to pay for, I think. But it's got all the different species in it and how to go through it. And then Here's the kelp farming manual, which again is a fairly thick document, but it's got all the details of how to go about this, all the equipment you have to buy, all that. If you're at all interested in this stuff, you can get all this stuff for free. Okay? And then, yes, go ahead.
Kind of from Susan's question, so if you're talking about the kelp picking up all these heavy metals and other things, couldn't we then ask the state to actually make mining companies put kelp beds in front of runoff? Because it would pick a lot of things up, you could pull it out and get it out of the water.
That's an interesting idea. I think that it, you know, it appeals to me, but I don't know that it would go over real well with the mining companies. But this is I'll leave these out. Anybody that wants one that really is interested in this, if you're not interested in it, this is that seafood farming marketing one, and I'll leave these out. And then you can have those. And then I also have a set of, somewhere, I have a set of the sheet that shows those. Maybe it's in here.
Mr. Freitag?
Yes.
Isn't your email address available on that Sea Grant website?
Yes,
In
it
case
is.
anybody had a
Yeah, and you can
question?
definitely, oh, here. Yeah, my email site is on the Alaska Sea Grant. If you just Google Alaska Sea Grant, look at Gary Freitag, you'll see Ketchikan, and I'll be right there, and you can get my email and everything right there. Here's it's a diagram. These are picture of each of these sites that I've got up on the board right there. That if you need to get to it, you can. And these are resources that you can download a lot of this stuff. There's quite a few sheets here. I don't know, there's probably 15. Yes.
How about give you a round of applause, and maybe you can ask me questions?
Sure. That's fine.
Everyone, please join me in thanking Gary for a wonderful presentation.